Hello, I'm doing a review for this book, The Big Fat Surprise by Nina Teicholz. Okay, I hope that's pronounced okay. I have done a little bit of research, but I apologise if it's not correct. So this book looks at the evidence to support the claim that a low-fat diet is good for health, particularly in comparison to a diet high in saturated fat. By saturated fat, I mean mostly animal-derived fat. It may seem obvious that a low-fat diet is good for health. After all, that is what authorities have told us, certainly for all of my lifetime. Why else would I make so much effort to eat foods I wouldn't choose to eat? But where does this claim come from, and is it scientifically sound? It turns out that, as with so many things we're told by governments and scientists, it's bollocks. Something I notice as I go through life is that when you look below the surface of a subject, you soon realise that most of what you've been told about it is not true. Last year I read The Vegetarian Myth by Lydia, which I highly recommend. It blew away all my preconceptions about what a healthy diet should be. And since then, I've been looking into this subject more deeply, and that's how I heard of Teicholz. I was so impressed listening to her speak on a YouTube video that I decided I wanted to read her book. Teicholz is an investigative journalist, and she has gone to great lengths to read lots of scientific papers and interview many scientists originally involved in establishing the health arguments for or against eating saturated fat and its alternatives. This is a really well-written book. It's easy to read, and whilst being detailed, it was still easy to follow. It constructively breaks down the arguments for eating less saturated fats and reduces them down to the matter of opinions that they seem to basically be. This book does not discuss the ethical reasons for not eating animals or current farming practices. These are important factors to consider, but they are huge topics on their own and are not covered in this book. The Big Fat Surprise is almost completely based on American diet history, research and advice. I didn't find that a problem, as many of these trends have been repeated where I live in the UK. And I remember these trends being huge here. Who remembers when low fat took off, when every product was trying to label itself as low fat, and the olive oil boom and the Mediterranean diet? Remember that? I do, and I didn't even do the food shopping then. What's more, I can recognise how all these messages sunk in to become believed as fact by me, as the goal, as what good people do. Who knew there was no scientific evidence to support it? After all, our modern advanced knowledge is strictly based in science, endorsed and promoted by the most prestigious and influential institutions and government agencies in the world, right? So, it was thought that saturated fat, which is mostly animal-derived fat, caused heart disease. This was a theory. Nevertheless, this theory has been promoted as gospel truth for generations. The reason saturated fat was thought to cause heart disease was because it could raise cholesterol. However, the link between cholesterol and heart disease turns out to be far more complex than once thought, and is nowhere near as straightforward as high cholesterol is bad. What's more, once a low-fat diet was decided to be the best for men who were more likely to suffer from heart disease, this diet was then also rolled out to encompass all men, women and children, again without a scientific basis. The vilification of saturated fats, which are predominantly animal-based fats, has led to vegetable oils taking their place, most often highly refined and hydrogenated, that's trans fats. Science which showed negative results for polyunsaturated oils and hydrogenated oils was generally ignored, and the scientists involved were discredited. That Americans came to see vegetable oil as the healthiest possible kind of fat was one of the more astonishing changes in our attitudes about diet in the 20th century. And nowadays, they're in almost all processed foods, from your biscuits to your bread. The United States had embarked upon a giant nutritional experiment to cut out meat, dairy, and dietary fat altogether, shifting calorie consumption over to grains, fruits, and vegetables. Saturated animal fats would be replaced by polyunsaturated vegetable oils. It was a new, untested diet, just an idea, presented to Americans as the truth. Many years later, science started to show that this diet was not very healthy after all, but it was too late by then, since it had been national policy for decades already. The amount of studies stacking up over the years that failed to show a link between saturated fats and poor health outcomes is truly shocking. The fact that this agenda continued and grew more and more extreme shows a level of agenda bias that is inexcusable, and one would have to question whether it resulted entirely out of incompetence or was influenced more heavily by vested personal interests. It was shocking to read that not only was the idea that lowering saturated fat is good for health based on very shaky foundations, but there was disturbing research coming out showing that low-fat diets could actually be bad for health, particularly for women and children. Did this cause scientific bodies and officials to halt recommending this diet? Not at all. We have all been told to lower our fat consumption ever further and to cut down on meat as much as possible. There is no solid science to support this. In fact, a lot of science says no to this. Science says we need animal products, and the fattier the better. Taken together, these trials have shown that the low-fat diet has at best proved ineffective against disease and at worst aggravated the risk for heart disease, diabetes and obesity. So, saturated fat has been surrounded with fear and hype, yet the evidence for those presumptions is just not there, despite many efforts to find it. Polyunsaturated fats and trans fats, however, the new technology from the last century, have been welcomed as our saviours from the presumed risks of saturated fats, with very little research done on their potential negative effects on health. And when science has exposed risks, it has been quickly silenced. It almost sounds like a conspiracy theory, but of course they don't exist. So, Teicholz also discusses the Mediterranean diet and highlights the almost invisible foundation that it has been built upon. It would be highly amusing if it wasn't what we had been told we should be eating for the last few decades. After exonerating saturated fat, Teicholz takes a brief look at carbohydrates and whether they could be contributing to the rising number of maladies that people live with and die from. Could it be the refined sugars, flours and grains that are causing our Western health problems rather than meat? Strange. These are the foods that we have been encouraged to eat in place of meat for decades. I've spent a lot of my adult life eating a high-carb diet and not a lot of meat. In fact, I would have cut out meat altogether if it hadn't been for the protests of the other people I cook for. I've used vegetable oils to cook with instead of animal fats, margarine instead of butter, and so on. Now I look into this subject and I find that what I get from animal fats is essential to good health. I find that vegetable oils are basically not fit for human consumption, and that carbs send your glycemic index up, which causes damage around your body and makes you hungry. Not only has this been the diet I have had for most of my adult life, but it's also what I've fed my kids. From this book, I find that there was no real basis for recommending this diet to us. And let's be clear, this diet is really fucking boring compared to a low-carb, high fat and protein diet. Am I surprised that science is so weak when examined? Am I surprised that science is manipulated to further personal agendas? Am I surprised at the extreme advice foisted on the public, enforced with fear, and not only ungrounded in real science, but in actual fact tending to be more harmful for our health? I've lived through the corona's clusterfuck, so of course none of this surprises me. There were many correlations between things I read in this book and the current crisis that we're experiencing, such as how is it possible that so many esteemed authorities could have made such an error? Roughly speaking, they jumped the gun, making official recommendations before proper trials had been conducted and disregarding those who cautioned that medical inventions should, according to the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. Or this quote from a scientific agency regarding the overestimation of vague research. The cure should not be worse than the disease. Repeatedly, science is manipulated and misrepresented to further a certain agenda, whilst other science is ignored, and there is a complete lack of common sense. Teicholz concludes that the advice that comes out of this book is that a higher fat diet is almost assuredly healthier in every way than one low in fat and high in carbohydrates. Practically speaking, this means eating whole fat dairy, eggs and meat, even fatty meat. In short, all those rich, forbidden foods we've denied ourselves for so long, because these foods are necessarily part of a healthy diet. Okay, here it is again. I'm off now to go and eat some bacon, cheese and double cream without any guilt. Okay, thank you.